Hi, this is Father Joe Cisetti. Thank you for joining me once again as we continue to explore this vast cafeteria that we call the world of prayer. What I'd like to talk about today is contemplative prayer. Contemplative prayer is really one of the simplest, but in some ways, a very difficult form of prayer as well. Contemplation is a word that has many meanings, so it's important that we define our terms. And there's three understandings of contemplation. Okay, one is where contemplation is used more or less like meditation. We use the memory, we use the intellect, perhaps even the will. We're putting things into the mind. We're thinking about things. So he meditated on the Passion of Christ. He contemplated the Passion of Christ. Basically the same thing. It can be taken as a more prayerful outlook on life, a prayerful, thoughtful outlook. This is a second understanding. Standing before God and listening to God in emptiness. It's similar to that third form of meditation that we talked about. It's almost like those start to overlap some. Then there's a third understanding of contemplation, and that involves prayer as resting in God without using the faculties of the soul, the memory, the intellect, and to a certain extent even the will. Okay, it involves emptying things out of the mind. So in that sense, it's kind of the opposite of meditation. Right? And for the purposes of this talk, I'm using that third understanding of contemplation. Contemplative prayer involves simply sitting and resting in the presence of God, not using the intellect or the memory, not in doing, but in being, to gently quiet the intellect and rest in the presence of God. One species of contemplative prayer involves choosing a word such as God or Jesus and simply repeating it vocally and then perhaps silently. The word is a means, not an end. It's like an infant's pacifier, all right? Just to quiet the soul down, to quiet the mind down. Once in some sort of interior silence, it may be set aside, but then picked up and used again as necessary. There's an image that I like to use for this type of prayer. All right, sunbathing. Okay, now obviously this is a metaphor, all right? And at St. Therese, we have the Wooldridge Center, named after John Wooldridge, a longtime business manager who died in the year 2000 of skin cancer. So I do not encourage people to go sunbathing, all right? But in terms of an image, in terms of a metaphor, if someone is sunbathing, you don't get the impression there's a whole lot of mental activity going on. You don't get the impression the person is necessarily asleep. What's the person doing? The person is just being. The person is receiving a light. And that can be an image, a metaphor of what we do in this prayer. All right, so some notes with this. It's good to start with a scripture passage, something about trust. A real good one to start with comes from Psalm 46, verse 11. Be still and know that I am God. And by the way, there is a handout all about this too that you can access as well. The point is to quiet the intellect. We don't try to suspend the intellect. We simply want to quiet the intellect. We want to rest in some interior silence, right? And it's always going to be a relative silence, at least almost always, all right? The effectiveness of this prayer isn't necessarily determined by what happens during the prayer time, but it can start to make a difference in our lives. And really the effectiveness of any prayer is measured by how we grow in love of God and love of neighbor. As with all types of prayer, distractions here are inevitable. And this is a type of prayer that requires us to have a lot of patience with ourselves. There can be these distractions that can come. They can even be good thoughts that come into our mind. But in either case, we simply refocus ourselves again and again, and we try to quiet the mind. And we can find ourselves doing that a lot. And that's where it requires us to have a great deal of patience with ourselves. The goal is union with God by simply resting in God. Okay? When you do this, it's good to give yourself about 15, 20 minutes, at least when starting out. As with all types of prayer, there can be a temptation to overfocus on technique. Okay, technique is helpful, but the most important thing is to just start praying. There is an outstanding resource for this. It's called The Cloud of Unknowing. There's a sequel to it, or at least a book by the same author called The Book of Privy Counseling. We don't know who the author is. It's a unknown mystic in England in the Middle Ages. Absolutely tremendous work, something for anyone interested in this type of prayer. I cannot recommend this book too much. This type of prayer isn't for everyone, but it is something that is helpful. It is something that some people certainly find helps them grow in that love of God and love of neighbor. Now, we still do the prayers that we recite, of course, and we still have our liturgical prayer, Mass and things like that, Mass and the sacraments and things like that as well. But this is something that is a very rich form of prayer as well. It's part of our heritage. And it's important that people at least have a little bit of knowledge about that and, see if it's for them or not. In the meantime, we move forward. And in the words of St. Paul, we rejoice in hope, we endure in affliction, and we persevere in prayer. See you next time.